It was only last month in the little island of Sulawesi in Indonesia, where there was a discovery of a 51,000-year-old cave painting. And that cave painting is now recorded as the oldest example of storytelling by humans. And we're fortunate in Australia here that we have bordering on 60,000 years of lineage of storytelling through the power of story through our First Nations people. And we'll have an example of that even today as well. So if I can, firstly, if you'll allow me to indulge you in a story. And the story takes us back to 1999, around 1999, 2000. The picture you can see here is probably not the bus we were on. That looks a bit too modern for the bus that we were on. But we had 2 coaches, we had 72 students, 8 staff, and 2 drivers of the coaches at the time that were taking a group of Year 11 students to Central Australia. The goal of taking them to Central Australia, we thought, was to help them, immerse them in more of the culture of this land and the beautiful landscape that is Australia and outback Australia. I was an outdoor education teacher at the time and a physical education geography teacher. So you might say it played to my forehand. But for the teenagers at 17 years old, they're post-pubescent, and they were trying to escape the Melbourne winter in many ways and get away from the trudgery of the June holidays. In doing so, they experienced quite a lot of red dust. They saw, as you might imagine, as those who've ever done the trip up the Stuart Highway, once you head north of Adelaide through to Coober Pedy and onto Central Australia, there isn't a heck of a lot of topography change along the way. It's not until you really get into Central Australia that it starts changing. So the opportunity to move away from roadside camping was a great opportunity. The reason I share this story is because this is where I first met this gentleman, Bob Randall, and had the opportunity to call him Uncle Bob at the time. And Uncle Bob Randall is an Aboriginal elder. And as an Aboriginal elder, he was going to be our guide for a couple of days while we were in the West Macdonald Ranges. And we met him in a place called Ellery Creek Big Hole. As well, and to this day, it still resonates with me, and I do think of him, on semi-regular occasions, largely because he was probably the first person that really introduced storytelling to me in any other form than books or films or a song. He did it, in a human form and walked us through the landscape and showed us stories that occurred all through the ranges, West Macdonald Ranges there, how they formed, what food we could eat, what food we couldn't eat, what we could and couldn't do and should and shouldn't do, according to what's called chukapa, which is cultural law. One of these beautiful stories, and it was 72 students, 8 staff, 2 coach drivers sitting around a campfire of an evening, and he said, "Is it okay if I bring out my guitar and share a story with you?" And I'd like to, I've had the opportunity to sort of explore this and found the story that was shared with us on that evening. And it was in song. And I'm not going to play the whole song, but I'm going to share the song with you to share with you how Uncle Bob shared story of the stolen generation and his role in it as a stolen child at the time. His song is called Brown Skin Baby, and it really highlighted for us what it was like to live through that period there, and he did it in song. So if you just bear with me, I was going to bring it up for you here.
This next song is the story of our experiences of the stolen generation. The system came into my life. Just 150 k's from here to where the sun rises in the east. A policeman arrived on his camel, saw me there with my family, and because I was who I was stolen. This is a song I composed for that time. brown skin baby, they take him away. As a young preacher I used to ride a quiet pony round the countryside in a native camp. I'll never forget a young black mother, her cheeks all wet. My brown skin baby, they take him away.
Now, I'll pause it there, as it'd be unfair to probably do the whole song, be very fair for those interested within Indigenous history and the cultural experience that it was at the time. Just for some backstory, Yawi was the sound that the crying mothers made as the babies were stolen from them there. And I still recall I do recall like it was yesterday, sitting around the campfire, and as a physical education, outdoor education, geography teacher as I was at the time, tears welling up in my eyes as Uncle Bob sang that song, because I could connect with it. Somehow he made us connect with it, and I wasn't sure how to experience that emotion at the time, until I looked around the rest of the campfire and saw that just about everyone was crying at the time, or in some way, but with a smile on their faces, they joined in with him in the song. It's probably the most moving campfire experience, and as an outdoor education teacher, I've had a heck of a lot of them that I've ever had, and because it had so much story sewed into it. So what makes stories so connecting, or allows us to connect with them? So let's have a look at, dive into a bit of the background with it and give us some insight as to what makes stories so meaningful, resonate with us, and so memorable. We can look at the definition if we were to, and we will. It's a connected series of events, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that's how my English teacher might have told me. Probably a better way is that it's a journey on which you can take the listener along for the ride. And when we do that, we do need to understand that stories are much more than definitions. So within the context of today and a lot of our programs, we are largely trying to get businesses, managers, and leaders to engage with their audience. And their audience could be people, their co-workers, it could be their customers, or it could be the marketplace. So how do they engage better with them? And story is an extremely powerful tool. I think we're all familiar with things like the Nescafe ad, different ads that are done from different motor vehicle companies. I always remember the Toyota What a Feeling ads. They try and sew story into it quite well. So what is the kind of story you're trying to tell? And is it an employee story? Is it a customer story? Is it a personal story that you want to share that'll give some insight to you and some backstory of you? Or is it a story about the market and how the market got to where it is? And once we've done that, we also need to be considerate, or this is also in our mind as well, who is the audience? Is it for the employees? Is it for customers? Is it the broader market? Who is it going to be for? Is it for colleagues, clients? So who is the audience? Because who the audience is will affect the type of story it is and how we tell it and what inclusions we might have. You'll see on the bottom left on this slide, that is, what do you want them to know, feel, and do? We discussed this quite a bit in sales and marketing because it's probably one of the more simple ways. That is, what do you want the customer to know? What do you want them to feel? What do you want them to do? Many people are very familiar with what you want them to know and what you want them to do, but the feeling is where this power of story comes in, and we call this an emotive connectiveness that comes in. And then fourthly, how will it land based on the audience needs? What are their interests? Are there any touch points that they might have, whether they be organizational, cultural, that might resonate with them? And are there any myths or doubts or misconceptions that we might need to allay or build into the story somehow to try and remove or minimize those? So what's happening with stories? So why do stories? And we'll have a look at the power of story and some examples for sure, absolutely. So don't fret, we will have some coming through with you. When we look at EEGs, when someone is watching or listening to a story that they find compelling, it lights up. It really does light up like a Christmas tree, they say, but it really does light up quite well. Or a lot of areas of the brain. If we're familiar with the story, not as many areas light up. And if it's not a compelling story, very few areas light up. So what is it that causes this lighting up? And without going too much into the topography of the brain, it's important to understand the role of different parts of the brain and trying to engage as many of them as possible. So a compelling and engaging story will tap into more regions of the brain, hence more areas of it light up on the electroencephalographs. Not that you're ever going to have access to that. So if we have a look at the temporal lobe, there's the hearing, there's the language that's used. If it taps into memory, what we call associative memory, if they can associate it with something, or if it's a new experience, it won't have that tap into memory. It creates a new memory. So if they can hear the story, we can tap into that lobe. But what if we can also help people see it? So we start getting the occipital lobe, which is huge for us as humans, very important for us. So we convert what we see into messaging. And then the parietal lobe, we start saying, well, is there touch, is there taste, is there temperature kicking in? So all of a sudden we start seeing the senses being involved. The more senses we can incorporate, the stronger the story will be. Now, we can't give the person the taste all the time, and we can't give them the temperature experiencing. But if and when telling a story, if we were talking about a story about insulation products, you need to be talking about how cold it is in winter and how you want to minimize the likelihood of that and remaining as cozy as possible for as little cost as possible. To remind them what it's like to be in that temperature, or to remind them what it's like of that taste if you're in hospitality, to remind them of the touch and feel of the fabric if you're in fashion, what it looks like, what it feels like, what it might sound like. The more we can tap into these, the more likely it is your story will be remembered or it will be memorable. So we have this area of what we call story immersion, right? So we often get immersed in stories, and the advent of streaming now and podcast, whether it be auditory or visual, through the podcasts or series on your streaming, on your television, has allowed us to immerse ourselves into story more and more and more. The written story, J.K. Rowling is now responsible, is accountable, responsible, and celebrated as an author who's encouraged more children to read than in history, full stop. And then we go into the advent of the podcast, the mini series that might appear on television or via streaming there. So the more regions they can tap into, the more it's going to make it more memorable for us. Now, as well as what's happening in the visual and the auditory and the olfactory, whatever it might be, all the systems that are going to be involved, there's also a beautiful chemical cocktail that's involved in story. And so the chemical cocktail that's involved in story is meaningful and engaging stories trigger neurotransmitters. And these neurotransmitters also allow us to have a release or an enhancement of certain hormones. And if we get this combination right in our storytelling, or when stories are told, it makes it a more memorable story. So cortisol is excitement, anticipation, suspense. So the thriller and action movies will do this to us. The suspense movie, keeping in the edge of your seat. So we might look at one of the, some of the greats of those. Dopamine gives us motivation and euphoria, great focus. It's what we call the adventurer's drug of choice. So we get that when we do thrill-seeking type activities, a dopamine hit. And oxytocin, which is the love or the trust hormone, which is why so many of the series that have those, what we sometimes call rom-coms, or the original Mills and Boon books, were so successful, because it released that hormone or played to that. The more of those that are involved, the more memorable the story is going to be. Now, while we can't always add these and subtract these, but we can build a bit of excitement into the story. We can allow the person to focus and really narrow their focus there and try and talk about the excitement of the feeling at the time to get the dopamine, and the trust level may come in, so we can start making this more and more memorable. How does a story flow? And for those who are readers there or ever listened to podcasts, or especially if you've ever watched certain movies, you will know that you've been taken on a journey a lot of the times. And this journey for us has been taken by, this model is from Gustav, it's called Freytag's Pyramid. Exciting name, isn't it? But Gustav Freytag, 19th century playwright and novelist. And what he had, he took us on a journey, right? Took us on a journey, and that is, whereas in the beginning, setting the scene there, and then faced with a problem, a scenario, a situation that was something that had to be solved. And then we have this rising action. This rising action is where events take place, and these events are moving us towards a climax. Now, these events takes on a bit of a roller coaster. They can be positive events or negative events, calamitous, celebratory along the way, but they're building us towards some sort of climax. As we get to this climax, we then have this falling action and where things get better. And with resolution at the end, there's some sort of lesson learned. Now, this is used, for some of us in business, we use them in a business story to tell a business case. It might be how it was very difficult in starting the business during the very beginning of COVID, had to overcome certain things, meet certain regulations. While there was allowances from the government, it didn't allow us to meet certain criteria and attract customers to the level we want. And then there was the end of it, and then things started coming back to a bit of a norm. But from there, we're able to re-employ people, re-engage, tap back into the market again. And while we have resolved it, we are a different company as a result of that. And this is one of the lessons we've learned along the way through this adversity. Probably one of the more famous models that links in with Gustav's pyramid is what Pixar use. And I've chosen Pixar largely because I think it's one of the greatest movies from Pixar. Nemo is one of the greatest movies from Pixar, other than Toy Story. But they have a 6-step process for their telling of a story. And it's very similar in taking us through the model here. So if you're familiar with it, and I hope you are, otherwise I'm going to have to take you on a quick journey. The Pixar model has a once upon a time, every day, until one day, because of that, and until finally. So once upon a time, for those who know the story, Marlin and his wife and his son, Nemo, were playing happily and lived a happy life amongst the coral and the anemones and the colour that was the Great Barrier Reef. It was a beautiful time for them. Every day before going out to play, Marlin would be reminded from his father to keep safe and stay near home, which is the anemone, amongst the fronds there, and to not go near the drop-off. Do not go near the drop-off because the ocean isn't safe. Every day this would take place until one day, in defiance of his dad's belief that he's not a good swimmer, Nemo decided to venture with some friends towards the drop-off. And he moved away from what was the safety. Because of that, he was captured in a net by a scuba diver at the time, as illegal as we know that is, captured by a scuba diver, and eventually he ends up in a fish tank in Sydney in a dentist's office. Because of that, his father goes on this journey from the Great Barrier Reef down to Sydney, meeting all sorts of adventures along the way, some of them calamitous, some of them celebratory, riding the East Australian current there with a turtle called Crush and a John Dory fish called Dory, very forgetful, some of us might remember. And this happens until finally, after the assistance of multiple people along the way, Nemo escapes along the down a drain in the dentist office. For those who remember, he comes out into Sydney Harbour, and again, surviving getting out of a net that's trapped some fish there. He's reunited with his father and Dory, and they go back to the beautiful Great Barrier Reef, and they live a life happily ever after. The lesson learned from Marlin, the big thing was, and it's very much about trust. The story is very much about trust, right? So the Pixar story model in this case in Finding Nemo is about trust, and it's about very much Marlin letting go. And life is good again, but it is different afterwards. So in many ways, very similar to the rising and falling action of Gustav's story. We have stories for empathy. So when we use stories for metaphors, sometimes we use stories, short ones for analogies and metaphors, but stories can be used to get messages across. Now, Finding Nemo is a long one. This one's an example. It's called Gandhi's Sandals. Now, Gandhi's Sandals is a story for empathy. And it was reported that Gandhi boards a train with a lot of supporters there. And upon exiting the train, one of his sandals falls between the train and the platform. Now, without missing a beat, Gandhi takes off his other sandal and throws it down between the train and the platform, to which one of the gentlemen around him asks, "What are you doing? Why did you take off your other shoe and throw it away?" He says, "Well, the man who finds one shoe is not fortunate, but the man who finds a pair of shoes, now he's a fortunate man." So we can use stories for empathy. So the story helps us because we won't have as many stories to tell, so we use other people's stories. We can use stories for perspective to solve a problem. And this is one of my favorite stories from a gentleman called William Ury, who wrote a book called Getting to Yes. Getting to Yes is one of the great books on negotiation. William Ury is considered one of the world's great negotiators and has negotiated many, many world-sized, global-sized problems. And it's a story of wisdom in negotiation. And upon his death, so if we go to the Middle East now, the journey takes us to the Middle East. Upon his death, a father leaves to his sons as the inheritance his camels. And there are 17 camels in all. Within his will, he says the eldest son is to receive half, the second eldest, the middle son, is to receive a third, and the youngest is to receive a ninth. Now, realizing that they can't divide 17 camels by a half, or a third, or a ninth, they're in a quandary, and now conflict arises. Amongst that conflict, they decide to seek the wisdom of one of the elders of the village, who was a wise old lady of the village at the time. And upon hearing and listening to their problem, she says, "I can help you solve this. I will give you my one and only camel." And they're so appreciative and so grateful because now they have 18 camels. With 18 camels, they realize they can divide 18 by a half. So the eldest son gets 9. By a third, the youngest son gets 6. And the younger son gets a ninth, he gets 2. Well, if we add the 9 and the 6 is 15 and the 2 is 17. Well, they realize now they have a camel left over and they can return the camel to the wise old lady, who smiles, walks the camel back out to the back and tethers it back up again. William Ury sharing of this story is a reminder for us sometimes. He says it's what's called balcony view. That is, to solve a problem, sometimes we need to step away from it, not be within it. And so stories can remind us to sometimes step away, take a different perspective, and taking a different perspective, the solution appears. So let's have a look at story now as a call to action. Here's a case study from Save the Children. Save the Children had 2 campaigns going, right? Campaign 1, data and information about children in poverty and the subsequent impact of them, attempting to gain donors. Campaign 2, story of a young Syrian girl and her struggle to achieve health and an education to which we should all have access. The outcome? Campaign 2 had 60% more donors, and each of those donors contributed almost twice the amount of each donor from campaign 1. The power of story in terms of trying to shift people's way of thinking and a call to action. Another one we have is a story of sales. So how do sales stories kick in? And so this is the great eBay study some of you may be familiar with. The eBay study had an individual who went and bought 200 items on eBay. The average price of each item was less than $1. And so for the 200 items that he bought on eBay, they cost him $129, all individual items. And this is one of the items there, the horsehead cup. It's a famous one. He then reached out to several authors, writers and promoters and asked them to write a story or something captivating about the item. And then he had put them back on eBay to resell them. One item that was bought for 99 cents ended up selling to the top bidder for $62, which is this cup you see. The total of all resold items, of the 200 items, ended up being just under $4,000. Remember, he bought them for $129. Now, there's a bit of crafty marketing and placement. Anyone knows eBay, but the power of story kicks in there within sales as well. This is a story of innovation and pushing boundaries. So if we're trying to do this, trying to get more out of our team, this is the famous Steve Jobs. Again, people might be familiar with this. Steve Jobs asked his engineers when he first released the iPod to make it smaller. And they said, we can't make it smaller. We've engineered and engineered and engineered it to make it smaller. Steve Jobs famously picked up the iPod and put it in the fish tank in his office and said, watch. And as they watched, small air bubbles came out of the iPod, as you'd expect. Then he turned to the engineers and says, where there was air, there was space. Took it out, said, now make it smaller. So how do we get more juice from the lemon? Right, so sometimes we need these stories to drive innovation, that something can be done. And stories can also shift perspectives. Right, so when we talk about the more recent stories that we've seen, and you may or may not have indulged yourself in this recent Netflix series, stories can change how we perceive and relate to others. Right. Following the Netflix series on the Beckhams, right, they're about at David and Posh Beckham, I think she's referred to as, I shouldn't be Victoria, I should say, apologies there. Beckham gained 500,000 new followers. Now, more people change their perception of him. All of a sudden, what happens sometimes when we see these stories is we'll hear people say things to the effect of, I found I quite like them now, despite my previously held beliefs. So this way, stories can be really powerful for individuals, for leaders, and for managers, and for businesses. We can shift how people think about us as well, right? Or others can do if the story is well crafted. So there's barriers as well. So let's sort of culminate in barriers to connecting with the audience. Why don't all stories resonate with people? And why don't all people resonate with the stories there? So there can be a lack of a central message. So sometimes you might finish a movie or a book or hear someone's story and go, I really don't know what the key message was. I really don't know what they were getting at. I don't know what that was all about. So there was no central message through a theme that sowed through the story. We can have a lack of authenticity, too much information. We sometimes say the devil's in the detail, but too much information leaves too much for interpretation and just gets too hard for us. We get what's called cognitive overload. The same if it's too lengthy. Inappropriate language, I have a term there, and excuse the indulgence here, it's called jargon monoxide, that I did here on a podcast not so long ago, and I love it to death, which is terminology we use that isn't always necessary. It's just jargon. And the jargon we use sometimes makes it difficult for the audience to interpret what we're saying, because that's the way we speak, our language. Sort of like the Valley Girls, you may remember back in the 80s there. A second last one, if it's one-dimensional. If it's one-dimensional, there's not enough stimulus going on, as you remember the brain diagram there. And there may be lack of passion or conviction from the storyteller or in the messaging. And therefore, remember, passion persuades, which is using Anita Roddick, founder of The Body Shop. That was her company motto, passion persuades. So to build passion within it. So our final consideration for today, as we wind up today's webinar, and it's a cluttered landscape of communication. It's going to be stories that break through, and stories do transcend time, language, and culture. Just as 51,000 years ago, this is a representation of what was found in Sulawesi on that small island only a very, very short time ago, only a matter of a month ago. So it's very, very relevant for us. Our next two webinars we have coming up we have one in August and we have one in the month after, September, and we'll have professional development planning is one. So planning for your professional development, if that's of relevance to you, make sure you register for that. And effective sales behaviors, which is a key part of a lot of our business, coaching people and managers and leaders and businesses on to be more effective in their sales practices. So thanks for joining us today. We appreciate your attendance. And for those who have attended, you will receive a recording. And for those who registered and weren't able to attend, of course, you've received the recording because that's how you're watching this today. Thanks very much for joining us today. My name is Greg Ward of the Marketing Sales Group, and we appreciate your time. Thank you.